Ask most people what they know about Italy in the Second World War, and the answer tends to come quickly. That Italy was the weak link. That Italian soldiers surrendered in their hundreds of thousands. That Allied troops joked about the ease of fighting them. That wherever Italian forces went, Greece, North Africa, East Africa, Russia, catastrophe followed. British soldiers in the Western Desert compared fighting Italians to a training exercise. American GIs landing in Sicily reported that entire formations gave up before a shot was fired. The reputation spread and calcified. It has lasted 80 years. There is a version of that story that is true. Italian forces did suffer catastrophic defeats. They did surrender in enormous numbers at specific moments. They were outfought consistently in certain theatres and under certain conditions. None of that is disputed. But the story built from those facts is incomplete in ways that matter. Consider the numbers. Italy fought in 6 theatres simultaneously. The Western Desert, East Africa, the Greek and Albanian mountains, the Soviet steppe, the Mediterranean, and eventually its own soil. Approximately 300,000 Italian military personnel were killed. Around 60,000 were taken prisoner by Soviet forces alone, of whom only 10,000 came home. The Folgore division held its position at El Alamein for 12 days after the men around it had withdrawn, surrendering only when ammunition and water were gone. The Ariete armoured division fought to its last tank. These are not the actions of an army that simply gave up. The real question is not whether Italy performed badly. It did across much of the war. The real question is why, and the answer has almost nothing to do with cowardice. It has to do with oil, with steel production, with an industrial base that was the smallest of any major belligerent, with tanks that could be pierced by machine gun fire, with an army that went to war in 1940 when its own commander-in-chief had privately written in 1939 that it would not be ready until 1943. This is the story of what happens when an empire built on rhetoric meets the arithmetic of industrial warfare. April 2nd, 1939. Rome. Benito Mussolini sat down and composed a memorandum to Adolf Hitler. The letter was not a declaration of intent or a coordination of plans. It was an admission. Italy's armed forces required substantial rearmament. The military would not be ready for major war before 1943 at the earliest, 4 years away. The man who had spent 17 years constructing the image of a renewed Roman Empire had privately acknowledged that the army bearing the fascist insignia could not yet fight a war of consequence. 6 months later, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Italy stood aside, citing unpreparedness. It was a calculation Mussolini described publicly as non-belligerence rather than neutrality, a distinction designed to preserve the appearance of fascist resolve. The military situation behind that distinction was considerably less composed. Italian warehouses held inadequate stocks of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. The navy lacked sufficient oil reserves to sustain prolonged operations. The army's armoured formations were equipped largely with the Carro Veloce 33, a small, lightly armoured vehicle that functioned more as a mobile machine gun platform than a fighting tank. So thinly protected that British armoured car crews could pierce its hull with standard heavy machine gun fire at combat range. The Air Force flew aircraft already a generation behind the standard being set over Poland. Italy's condition in 1939 was the product of historical and structural circumstances stretching back decades, not months. The Risorgimento, Italian unification, was completed only in 1861. France had been industrializing since the late 18th century, Britain since the mid-18th century. Germany had unified in 1871, but possessed the Rhine-Ruhr industrial complex from the outset, giving it a manufacturing base that expanded rapidly under Wilhelmine investment. Italy arrived late to every industrial race that mattered. Italy entered the 20th century with a genuinely industrialized north, the Milan-Turin-Genoa triangle, producing steel, vehicles, and precision machinery, and a largely agrarian south that contributed little to industrial output. The Mezzogiorno was not a peripheral concern. It was roughly half the country's geography and a substantial portion of its population, functioning as a permanent drag on aggregate industrial productivity. Italy was, in economic terms, 2 countries wearing 1 uniform. By 1939, less than a third of Italy's total workforce was employed in industry. In Germany, that figure exceeded 42%. Italian industrial output measured against the other major belligerents placed it last among them. Italy's total output at the war's outset was broadly comparable to Germany's output from approximately 40 years earlier. Britain's output was nearly double Italy's. The gap was not closing, it was widening. Italy possessed almost no domestic oil production. Coal reserves were insufficient for military industrial demand and required continuous importation, primarily from Germany via Alpine rail routes. Once Mediterranean sea lanes became contested, every fuel-dependent military operation, armoured advances, aerial operations, naval sorties, faced supply constraints that German and British commanders operating in the same theatre did not share. Italian armoured formations in North Africa halted repeatedly not because of enemy action but because fuel convoys crossing from Tripoli or Benghazi had been sunk or delayed. The Regia Marina, the Italian Royal Navy, possessed 6 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, and 14 light cruisers at the war's opening. On paper, a substantial fleet. Sortie rates were constrained by fuel allocation from the outset. German authorities controlled the Alpine rail routes, and German supply priority consistently placed Italian naval fuel requirements below Wehrmacht ground force demands. The Royal Navy operated from Gibraltar and Alexandria with fuel stocks backed by the global reach of the British supply system. The Regia Marina operated from Taranto, La Spezia and Messina with oil reserves that German supply schedules determined. The Italian arms industry added its own complications to an already constrained supply chain. Defence manufacturers operated within cartelised arrangements that effectively insulated them from accountability. Companies submitted inflated cost estimates, delivered equipment below contracted specification, and used the implicit threat of production disruption as leverage against procurement officers who raised objections. The industrial concerns understood that the state required weapons and had no credible alternative supplier base to turn to. Italian battleships constructed in the late 1930s cost approximately twice as much per unit as comparable French vessels built in the same period. The excess expenditure did not purchase superior capability, it purchased cartel margins. Government ministries had no practical recourse. The procurement system was effectively coerced into accepting overpriced equipment because the alternative was receiving nothing at all. In documented cases, weapons delivered under contract were found on inspection to fall below the specifications they had been contracted against. The manufacturers faced no meaningful consequences. The military accepted the equipment regardless because an empty armoury was worse. Production methods imposed their own ceiling on output. German, British and American manufacturers had adopted mass production principles, standardised components, assembly line throughput, interchangeable parts, that allowed rapid scaling in response to wartime demand. Italian manufacturing retained a more artisanal character. Skilled workers produced weapons in smaller batches, with higher individual input per unit, but dramatically lower total throughput. The difference between a country that builds weapons in small workshops and one that builds them on assembly lines is not visible in peacetime. In total war, it is everything. Between 1940 and 1943, Italy produced approximately 10,000 aircraft. Germany produced 60,000 in the same period. The United States produced 157,000. In armoured vehicles, Italy manufactured roughly 4,000 across the entire war. Germany produced approximately 19,000. The United States produced around 58,000. Italy had expended equivalent national resources and received a fraction of the inventory those resources should have purchased. What Italy did produce was frequently inadequate for the demands placed on it. The Carro Veloce 33, designated the L3 in most operational accounts, and the most common Italian armoured vehicle at the war's opening, weighed 3.2 tons and carried armour only 14mm thick on its frontal plate. It mounted twin 8mm Breda machine guns as its primary armament, with no provision for an anti-tank weapon of any meaningful calibre. Italian commander Italo Balbo, a senior figure within the fascist hierarchy and military command, assessed its operational value with clinical brevity. Our light tanks, already old and armed only with machine guns, are completely outclassed. The machine guns of the British armoured cars pepper them with bullets and easily pierce their armour. The Fiat M13/40, Italy's primary medium tank through the North African campaign, weighed approximately 14 tons, mounted a 47mm gun in a rotating turret, and carried armour up to 40mm on the frontal surfaces. It was a step forward from the L3. The steel used in its construction was of poor metallurgical quality, with impurity levels that reduced structural integrity under ballistic impact. The hull was assembled with riveted joints rather than welded construction. When the vehicle absorbed a direct hit, rivet heads sheared inward at high velocity, creating secondary fragmentation hazards inside the fighting compartment, independent of whether the round fully penetrated the armour. Italian tanks across all variants lacked radios as standard equipment through much of the campaign period. Individual tank commanders could not communicate with adjacent vehicles during engagements. Formation manoeuvres could not be adjusted in response to shifting enemy positions. The German model of armoured warfare, the blitzkrieg approach that had dismantled France in 6 weeks, depended on continuous radio communication between vehicles, troop commanders and formation headquarters, allowing rapid tactical adaptation. Italian armoured units, absent that communication layer, were constrained to pre-planned manoeuvres the enemy could observe and counter. Where a German panzer commander could redirect his formation mid-battle in response to an unexpected opportunity, an Italian armoured commander was bound to the plan he had issued before the engagement began. Mussolini's political position shaped the command structure in ways that compounded every material deficiency. His authority derived from the consent of King Victor Emmanuel III and the tolerance of the senior officer corps. He could be removed. He knew it. The result was a leadership posture defined by institutional management rather than strategic clarity, favouring generals whose loyalty was reliable over generals whose competence was demonstrable. Pietro Badoglio, the chief of the Supreme Command, Italy's most senior military position, was broadly respected within the military establishment. Mussolini viewed that respect as a political threat. When campaigns failed, blame was distributed downward. Rivals were discredited before they could accumulate sufficient reputation to become threats. Senior officers spent energy managing the political implications of failure rather than diagnosing its causes. The 3 service branches, the Regia Esercito, the Army, the Regia Marina, the Navy, and the Regia Aeronautica, the Air Force, operated with institutional independence that precluded effective coordination. The Aeronautica resisted any tasking that implied subordination to ground force requirements. Close air support missions, the kind of coordinated ground attack operations that were decisive in German and later Allied operations, were treated within the Air Force as a misuse of assets whose proper role was strategic bombardment and fleet defence. Italian ground units advancing in North Africa and Greece did so without reliable air cover. The 3 services conducted 3 separate wars. None of them won. June 10th, 1940. Italy declared war on France and Britain. France was already collapsing under German pressure. The Italian declaration came after German armoured formations had reached the Seine, and Paris had been declared an open city. Mussolini ordered an offensive across the Alpine frontier on June 21st, 3 days before the Franco-German armistice. Italian forces advanced against defensive positions already being abandoned and still suffered approximately 6,000 casualties in 4 days of fighting. The armistice ended the operation before it could develop further. Italy received a narrow strip of Alpine territory. The gains bore no proportion to the stated ambitions. August 1940. The Duke of Aosta, a commander of Italian East Africa, the territory encompassing Ethiopia, Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, moved forces against British Somaliland on the Horn of Africa. The operation employed approximately 26,000 men against a British and Commonwealth garrison of roughly 4,500. Italian formations advanced across a broad front, employing black-shirt colonial units alongside regular army formations. The British conducted a fighting withdrawal under Brigadier Arthur Chaytor and evacuated by sea from the port of Berbera. Italy held British Somaliland. It was the first unambiguous territorial gain of the war. September 9th, 1940, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, commander of Italian forces in Libya, committed the Italian 10th Army across the Libyan frontier into Egypt. 5 divisions, approximately 80,000 men, advanced east along the Mediterranean coastal road. Graziani's orders called for a drive to the Suez Canal, roughly 500 kilometres beyond the frontier wire. The 10th Army advanced 65 kilometres to the coastal town of Sidi Barrani and stopped. Supply lines were insufficient to support further advance. Graziani established a series of fortified camps around Sidi Barrani and declared the army in need of consolidation before resuming. The fortified camps sat at intervals across the desert, with gaps between them that no motorised reserve existed to cover. British Western Desert Force Commander General Richard O'Connor received authorisation in November for what was planned as a 5-day raiding operation against those camps. What followed lasted 2 months and destroyed an entire Italian army. Operation Compass launched on December 9, 1940, with 36,000 British and Commonwealth troops executing a penetration through the gap between the Nibewa and Tuma camps. The 4th Indian Infantry Division struck Nibewa from the west as the 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, passed through and swung north to cut the coastal road. The Matilda 2 infantry tanks of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment leading the assault carried armour up to 78mm on the hull front, impervious to every anti-tank weapon the Italian garrison possessed. 42 Matildas rolled through the wire at Nibewa. The Italian Maletti Group's L3 tankettes engaged them and were destroyed. General Pietro Maletti, commanding the group, was killed in the opening minutes. The camp fell before noon. The dispersed Italian camp system, strung along the coast with insufficient depth and no motorised reserve to reinforce threatened positions, allowed British forces to encircle and reduce each camp in turn. Italian units within individual camps frequently fought until surrounded and their ammunition exhausted. The aggregate result was not determined by the performance of those units, it was determined by the geometry of the defensive layout. O'Connor's force destroyed the entire 10th Army. Approximately 130,000 Italian prisoners were taken. British and Commonwealth casualties totaled approximately 2,000. Graziani had understood the problem he faced. Italian formations, largely foot-mobile, could not respond quickly enough to outmaneuver a more motorised enemy. His solution, the fixed fortified positions, introduced a different vulnerability. The positions sat too far apart for mutual support, and there was no mechanised reserve to plug breaches. His tactical geometry created a series of isolated targets that O'Connor could destroy in sequence, each falling before the next could be reinforced. The superiority in numbers that the 10th Army held on paper was never brought to bear at any single point of contact. The East Africa campaign developed along lines determined largely by geography. Italian East Africa, comprising Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, was separated from metropolitan Italy by the entire length of the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and the Red Sea. Once Britain retained control of Egypt and Aden, the territory was isolated from resupply. Pre-war stockpiling provided finite reserves of ammunition, fuel, and equipment. They could sustain operations for months. They could not sustain a prolonged campaign against converging enemy pressure indefinitely. The Duke of Aosta commanded approximately 250,000 men, a substantial force in number, though the majority were Eritrean and Ethiopian colonial troops under Italian officers, not the regular army formations Italy was simultaneously deploying elsewhere. British and Commonwealth forces converged from 3 directions beginning in January 1941. General William Platt advanced from Sudan in the north. General Alan Cunningham's East African force drove north from Kenya. In the Somali theatre, British forces re-entered the territory lost the previous August. Aosta conducted the retreat with consistent tactical competence, selecting successive defensive positions in the Ethiopian highlands where terrain amplified the defensive value of his available forces. At Keren in Eritrea, Italian and colonial units held a mountain position against Platt's force for 55 days. The terrain at Keren channeled British attacks into narrow defiles covered by prepared Italian fire positions on the heights above. The British suffered 4,500 casualties taking the position. It delayed the entire northern advance by nearly 2 months. Aosta's final stand came at the plateau fortress of Amba Alagi, at approximately 3,200 metres above sea level. He held it with approximately 7,000 men against converging British columns from north and south. Ammunition ran short. Food supplies diminished. On May 19, 1941, Aosta requested terms. The position surrendered the following day with the honours of war, a formal military acknowledgement of the garrison's conduct. Aosta himself died of tuberculosis the following year while a prisoner in Kenya. The entire East African theatre, an empire Mussolini had assembled through the brutal Ethiopian campaign of 1935 to 1936, and it was gone. By June 1941, it had lasted 35 months under Italian control. October 28, 1940, Greece. Without informing Hitler or coordinating with German High Command, Mussolini issued an ultimatum to Greek Prime Minister Ioannis Metaxas, demanding Italian occupation of unspecified strategic points across Greek territory. The ultimatum expired after 3 hours. Metaxas refused. Italian forces simultaneously crossed the Albanian-Greek frontier along a front extending roughly 60 kilometers through the Pindus mountain range, some of the most rugged terrain in Europe. 8 divisions, approximately 87,000 men, moved into terrain that Italian military commanders had internally assessed as requiring a minimum of 20 divisions. The Pindus range presented supply and maneuver challenges that degraded Italian operational capability from the first day. Roads through the mountains were few, narrow, and impassable to wheeled transport once the autumn rains began, and they began within days of the invasion. Mule columns carried forward the ammunition and rations that trucks could not. Artillery pieces were manhandled through mountain passes by hand in sectors where even mule tracks were too narrow for drawn guns. Temperature at elevation dropped below freezing within a week. Italian formations issued with summer weight uniforms began reporting frostbite casualties before the second week of November. Logistics collapsed under the combination of terrain, weather, and infrastructure. The Greek army fought with a tactical aggression that Italian intelligence had not anticipated. Greek formations knew the terrain. They used ridgelines and valley floors to channel Italian advances into killing grounds, prepared before the invasion began. The Italian Giulia Alpine Division, an elite mountain warfare formation from the northeastern Italian Alps, was partially encircled in the Pindus passes during the first week and fought its way out at severe cost. The operation Mussolini had publicly predicted would last 2 weeks was producing casualty reports within a fortnight that indicated structural failure. By the end of November, Greek forces had pushed the entire Italian line back across the Albanian border. Italian formations that had crossed as attackers were now defending Albanian soil against a Greek counter-offensive. The front stabilized through the winter in conditions of extreme hardship. Italian troops endured temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, inadequate shelter, insufficient winter clothing, and food rations reduced by supply failures. Frostbite claimed extremities before wounds could claim lives. Medical facilities in Albania were overwhelmed. Evacuation from frontline positions required mule transport across mountain tracks that closed entirely during heavy snowfall. Mussolini responded to the Greek failure by dismissing Badoglio and replacing him with General Ugo Cavallero. Badoglio had formally protested the invasion plan before it was launched, and had been denied the resources he requested. His dismissal framed those objections as incompetence rather than prescience. Cavallero received the same inadequate resource base and was tasked with producing different results. He did not. Germany resolved the Greek campaign by main force in April 1941. Operation Marita, the German invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece, committed 24 Wehrmacht divisions with Luftwaffe close air support to simultaneous operations across the Balkans. The Greek defensive line, which had held Italian forces for 6 months, collapsed in 11 days against German armoured penetration. The Greek army surrendered on April the 23rd. Italian formations participated in the final occupation, but had contributed nothing to the military decision. The Greek campaign consumed approximately 13,000 Italian dead, 25,000 wounded, and roughly 27,000 prisoners. June 22nd, 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Mussolini offered Italian participation immediately. The offer served Italian political interests, demonstrating alignment with the German partner and ensuring a seat at the eventual peace settlement. The Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, known by its Italian initials as the CSIR, a force of roughly 62,000 men in 3 divisions, deployed under General Francesco Zingales, and was assigned to Army Group South Sector between the Don and Donets rivers. 3 divisions, Pasubio, Torino, and Celere, arrived in Romania by rail in late July 1941. The CSIR was the most motorized Italian formation deployed to that point, though motorization remained significantly below German standard. The Corps operated across open steppe, river valleys, and terrain that bore no resemblance to the Alpine and North African environments for which Italian equipment and doctrine had been partially adapted. Supply lines stretched from Italian railheads through Romania and across Ukrainian roads. The German logistics priority dominated. Italian units frequently received fuel, ammunition, and rations behind schedule or below allocation, as German formations with higher priority drew first from available stocks. Italian infantry demonstrated consistent tactical capacity when positions were prepared, when artillery support was available, and when flanks were covered by German formations. In open maneuver operations, the Corps' limited motorization constrained its ability to maintain pressure on withdrawing Soviet forces. The CSIR fought through the summer and autumn of 1941 in the Donets Basin and along the Mayas River, holding river-crossing positions against Soviet counterattacks and conducting local offensive operations when German requirements demanded it. The Corps suffered approximately 5,000 dead and 14,000 wounded through its first operational year. It was replaced and substantially expanded before the second. Mussolini expanded the Italian commitment in 1942. The force was redesignated the Armata Italiana in Russia, the Armia, and grew to 229,000 men organised into 9 divisions, eventually reaching 11 under the 8th Italian Army. The expansion was driven by political considerations at the Rome-Berlin level rather than operational assessment of what the Italian military could sustain at that distance and scale. Logistics were inadequate before a single additional division arrived. The expansion made them more so. The 8th Italian Army held a sector of the Don River front, stretching approximately 270 kilometres, positioned on the left flank of the German 6th Army as it advanced towards Stalingrad in autumn 1942. The formations holding it lacked sufficient anti-tank weapons to defend against armoured assault. Soviet T-34 tanks, the standard Soviet medium tank, which outclassed most Axis armour it encountered, could not be reliably penetrated by Italian 47mm anti-tank guns beyond point-blank range. Requests from Italian commanders for German 75mm Pak-40 anti-tank guns were repeatedly deferred. The Armia received some additional artillery and a limited number of German assault guns, insufficient for the frontage it held. The vulnerability was documented, assessed, and left unremedied. Italian commanders understood what would happen if Soviet armoured formations struck in strength. Their written assessments recorded the deficiency explicitly. The remedies they requested did not arrive before the offensive that made those assessments irrelevant. November 19, 1942. Soviet Operation Uranus launched north and south of Stalingrad simultaneously, targeted at the weakly held German flanks. The Romanians on the Don's northern bend collapsed within 48 hours. On November 20th, the southern arm of the Soviet pincer broke through Romanian Third Army. The German 6th Army at Stalingrad was encircled. December 11, 1942. Soviet Operation Ostrogozhsk-Rossosh launched directly against the 8th Italian Army sector. Soviet armoured formations, the 1st and 3rd Guards armies, supported by multiple tank corps, struck at multiple points along the Italian line simultaneously. Italian infantry divisions holding open steppe positions had insufficient anti-tank weapons to stop armoured penetration. Where T-34 tanks broke through, adjacent infantry positions became untenable within hours. The Sforzesca, Corseria, and Ravenna divisions, the frontline formations of the 8th Army, were struck in the opening phase. Italian infantry at those positions engaged T-34 tanks with rifles, machine guns, and the few anti-tank weapons available. The operational result was not changed by those local actions. The line collapsed. The Italian Alpini Corps, the Tridentina, Giulia, and Cuninse Alpine divisions, the mountain warfare elite of the Italian army, held positions further north and were initially less directly engaged. The Alpini were recruited from the northern Italian mountain valleys, trained and equipped specifically for high-altitude warfare in snow and rock. They found themselves on a frozen steppe defending river positions against mechanized assault, for which nothing in their training had prepared them. The Giulia division was partially encircled in the opening days. The Cuneanze was struck on its flanks as adjacent formations collapsed. The retreat that followed lasted from December 1942 through January 1943. Surviving Italian formations mixed with remnants of German and Hungarian units moved west through temperatures that fell below -30 degrees Celsius on the open steppe. Men marched carrying weapons and ammunition as long as ammunition lasted, then carried weapons without ammunition, then carried nothing. Frostbite progressed through the exposed extremities and fingers, toes, earlobes, and advanced to hands and feet when temperature sustained below -20 for multiple days. Medical facilities were encircled or abandoned. Horses died from cold faster than men, and artillery pieces were left on the frozen roads when the teams pulling them could not continue. The Tridentina Alpine Division under General Luigi Reverberi fought its way out of encirclement at Nikolaevka on January 26, 1943. Soviet forces holding the town blocked the retreat route for the entire Italian column, several tens of thousands of men, including large numbers of wounded. Reverberi personally led the assault, advancing on foot with his staff when command vehicles became stuck. Italian Alpini infantry attacked into dug-in Soviet positions, crossed the town, and opened a corridor through which survivors of multiple divisions passed. Reverberi was wounded during the assault. Italian accounts from the engagement record Soviet and Italian dead lying together in the streets of the town as survivors moved past them going west. Survivors reached German lines in groups ranging from individual men to small columns of hundreds. Many had discarded their weapons when ammunition was spent. Some had walked for 3 weeks across open steppe, navigating by stars and the direction of artillery sound. The Army R ceased to exist as an operational force by February 1943. Total Italian losses on the Eastern Front reached approximately 90,000, killed, missing or dead of wounds and exposure, with a further 30,000 wounded and evacuated. Approximately 60,000 men were taken prisoner by Soviet forces. Italian repatriation figures after the war's end accounted for approximately 10,000 survivors of Soviet captivity from that prisoner population. The remainder did not return. The remaining Italian forces in North Africa, fighting alongside German formations under Erwin Rommel's command, continued through 1942 and into early 1943. The North African campaign had produced a different picture of Italian military capability than Operation Compass had suggested. Under unified command with adequate logistics and clear operational direction, Italian units demonstrated a tactical capacity that stood in direct contrast to the performance of Italian-commanded operations. The difference was consistent enough to constitute a pattern. The Ariete Armoured Division, Italy's most capable armoured formation built around M13/40 medium tanks and motorised infantry, operated as Rommel's flank guard through the critical phases of the campaign. At Bir el Gubi in November 1941, the Ariete engaged the British 22nd Armoured Brigade's Crusader tanks in a sustained action, holding its ground against numerically superior armour. At Gazala in May 1942, the Ariete held the southern flank of the Axis line against British armoured counterattacks that, if successful, would have cut off the entire German penetration. The division absorbed pressure from the 1st South African Division and elements of the 7th Armoured Division, while Rommel's main force operated to the north. The Ariete was eventually destroyed at the Second Battle of El Alamein in November 1942, continuing to resist as British armour drove past it on all sides. German signals intercepts from the closing phase of the battle recorded the Ariete's final transmission as reporting it had been surrounded and was still fighting. The Folgore Parachute Division, Italy's airborne formation trained to jump from aircraft and fight behind enemy lines, occupied a section of the southern El Alamein line during the same battle. Deployed in a static desert defence role rather than the airborne operations it had been trained for, the Folgore's value was its selection standard and training intensity rather than its specialist role. When Montgomery's 8th Army launched its offensive against the southern flank of the El Alamein position, the Folgore sector was subjected to sustained artillery bombardment and infantry assault. The division held its positions for 12 days after surrounding formations had withdrawn. Ammunition ran out. Food and water deliveries stopped when the surrounding desert had been taken by British forces. The men conducted their final defensive actions on minimum rations, with weapons cleaned and maintained in conditions where water for drinking was scarce. Approximately 1,000 men remained combat effective at the point of surrender on November 6, 1942, from a divisional establishment that had exceeded 5,000 at the battle's opening. Italian naval special operations produced results disproportionate to the resources committed. The Decima Flotilla EMAS, the 10th Light Flotilla, a specialist unit operating human torpedoes and underwater explosive devices against enemy shipping, was among the most capable formations in any service of any nation. In December 1941, a team of 6 operators under Lieutenant Luigi Durand de la Penne penetrated the main fleet anchorage at Alexandria Harbour in Egypt, bypassing multiple anti-submarine net defences and harbour patrols. De la Penna's crew attached a delayed action charge beneath HMS Valiant. A second crew placed their charge beneath HMS Queen Elizabeth, two of the Royal Navy's most powerful battleships. Both battleships settled on the harbour bottom, immobilised for months. De la Penne was captured before the detonations, held aboard Valiant, and warned the ship's captain minutes before the charge fired, reducing casualties. Both vessels, resting on the bottom, continued to fly their ensigns and conduct normal harbour routine to conceal their condition from Axis reconnaissance. The operation temporarily eliminated British capital ship superiority in the eastern Mediterranean. It was accomplished by 6 men using oxygen rebreathers at depth, navigating through cold water in zero visibility by compass and dead reckoning, past multiple layers of anti-submarine netting and harbour patrol craft. The Decima MAS conducted similar operations at Gibraltar, Malta, and Algiers in subsequent years. The aggregate damage inflicted on Allied shipping was significant relative to the force employed and the resources consumed. May 12, 1943. The last Axis formations in Tunisia surrendered to Allied forces. Army Group Africa, the combined German and Italian force that had fought across Libya and Tunisia for 2 years, ceased to exist. Approximately 130,000 prisoners were taken, of whom roughly 50,000 were Italian. The entire North African theatre was closed. Sicily lay 160 kilometres to the north. July 9, 1943. The largest amphibious operation to that point in history assembled off the southern coast of Sicily. Operation Husky committed 150,000 British, American and Canadian troops to simultaneous beach landings along a 150-kilometre front. Italian coastal defence divisions, composed largely of older conscripts in their 30s and 40s, with limited training, inadequate weapons and no mechanised support, occupied the beach positions. Many units abandoned their positions within hours of the landings beginning. Italian field divisions further from the beachhead fought more coherently, but the operational situation deteriorated faster than defensive reorganisation could manage. Sicily was occupied in 38 days. Italian and German forces evacuated approximately 100,000 troops across the Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland. July 24, 1943. The Grand Council of Fascism, Italy's senior governing body, the Assembly of Fascist Party leadership, convened at Rome and voted 19-8 against Mussolini. The motion, proposed by Dino Grandi, stripped Mussolini of supreme command. The following morning, King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed him, appointed Pietro Badoglio, the same general Mussolini had scapegoated over Greece 3 years earlier, as Prime Minister and had Mussolini arrested. Badoglio's government entered secret armistice negotiations with the Allies. The negotiations concluded with a formal instrument of surrender on September 3rd, publicly announced on September 8th. The announcement caught Italian military commanders across multiple theatres without orders or preparation. No coordinated instructions had been issued for the period following the announcement. No arrangements had been made for how Italian forces should respond to German formations already moving to occupy Italian positions. Individual commanders faced a simultaneous choice with no guidance from Rome: resist the Germans, attempt to join Allied forces, or lay down arms. Within hours of the announcement, German forces began disarming Italian units across the country. On the Greek island of Cephalonia, the Acqui Division, Wutzenach, an Italian garrison formation, declined German demands for disarmament. For 9 days, September 13th to 22nd, 1943, the division resisted German forces supported by artillery and Stuka dive bombers. The division's commander, General Antonio Gandin, was killed in the fighting. After the island fell, German forces executed approximately 5,000 Italian prisoners, the majority of the division's surviving strength. Over several days following the surrender, approximately 500 Acqui survivors escaped. Bodies were burned to prevent later identification. Italian naval vessels received orders from Rome to sail to Allied-controlled ports. Some did. Others were seized by German forces in port. The fleet's core units, battleships Roma, Italia and Vittorio Veneto, with accompanying cruisers and destroyers, sailed from La Spezia toward Malta. German aircraft intercepted the fleet on September 9th. 2 Fritz X radio-guided bombs struck Roma. She sank within 20 minutes. 1,352 men died. The surviving ships reached Malta and were interned. The Regia Marina, which had fought for 3 years to contest the Mediterranean, ended the war at anchor under Allied supervision. Northern Italy became the territory of the Italian Social Republic, known as the RSY, a German-controlled puppet state established under occupation with Mussolini as its nominal head. German SS forces extracted Mussolini from imprisonment at Campo Imperatore on September 12th in an airborne raid commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Otto Skorzeny. Mussolini was flown to Germany, met Hitler, and returned to lead the RSY from its capital at Salo on Lake Garda. German military and SS authorities held effective power. The RSY's armed forces, the National Republican Army, the Republican National Guard, and the autonomous Decima Mass unit under Junio Valerio Borghese, were equipped and supplied at German discretion. Within the RSU's territory, a civil war developed alongside the conventional Allied German campaign advancing from the south. Italian partisan formations, communist, socialist, liberal and Catholic resistance groups operating under the Committee of National Liberation, conducted guerrilla operations against German occupation forces and RSY formations. By the winter of 1944, partisan formations in the northern Apennines and the Po Valley, numbered in the tens of thousands, organized into brigades and divisions conducting ambushes, sabotage and intelligence collection for Allied commands. German reprisals targeted civilian populations systematically. The massacre at Marzabotto in October 1944, killing approximately 770 civilians. The Ardeatine Caves massacre in Rome in March 1944, killing 335 men and boys. RSI forces participated in anti-partisan operations throughout the occupation period. The conventional campaign up the Italian peninsula proceeded through terrain that German commander Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's defensive preparations exploited consistently. The Gustav Line, a fortified defensive belt anchored on Monte Cassino and the Rapido River Valley, halted the Allied 5th and 8th Armies from November 1943 through May 1944. Monte Cassino, a Benedictine abbey atop a commanding ridge that dominated the valley below, changed hands 4 times before Polish Second Corps under General Ladislaw Anders took the position on May 18, 1944. Rome fell on June 4th. The advance continued to the Gothic Line in the northern Apennines, where Kesselring's second major defensive position delayed final breakthrough through the autumn and winter of 1944. April the 25th, 1945, German and RSY forces in northern Italy collapsed. Partisan formations emerged from the mountains and occupied cities ahead of advancing Allied columns. Mussolini, travelling in a German convoy attempting to reach Switzerland via Lake Como, was identified by communist partisan forces at the village of Dongo on April the 27th. He was separated from the convoy, detained overnight, and executed the following morning at the gate of Villa Belmonte in Giulino di Mezzegra. His body and those of several executed RSY officials were transported to Milan and hung inverted from the girders of a petrol station in Piazzale Loreto. The formal German surrender in Italy was signed at Caserta on May 2, 1945. 6 days before the war in Europe ended, Italian losses across the entire period from June 1940 to May 1945 reached approximately 300,000 military dead, killed in action, dead of wounds, and dead in captivity. Civilian deaths, including those from Allied bombing, German reprisals, and the partisan war, numbered between 150 and 200,000. The Regia Esercito as a pre-war institution ceased to exist. Its equipment consumed by 5 years of operations, its industrial base could never adequately sustain. What the operational record establishes, examined across its complete span, is a consistent relationship between Italian unit performance and the conditions under which those units operated. The absence of radio communication in armoured formations, the inadequacy of anti-tank weapons against modern enemy armour, the deficiency in motorisation relative to the operational tempo demanded, these were not matters of training or will. They were matters of steel, throughput, petroleum reserves, manufacturing capacity and industrial investment. Italy could not produce the weapons it required at the rate the war consumed them. The fascist regime had spent 2 decades constructing a public identity around the imagery of Roman military renewal. The rhetoric shaped the built environment of Italian cities, the curriculum of Italian schools, the organisation of Italian youth movements, and the foreign policy ambitions that carried Italian forces to Spain, Ethiopia, Albania, Greece, North Africa, East Africa, and the Soviet Union simultaneously. The material foundation of that ambition was an economy that industrialized late, possessed minimal domestic energy resources, and sustained an arms industry characterized by cartel pricing, political leverage, and systematic fraud. Modern industrial warfare is not decided by the grandeur of its stated objectives. It is decided by the rate at which a state can convert raw materials into operational military capability and replace losses faster than the enemy inflicts them. Germany produced 60,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1943. Britain produced 45,000. The United States produced 157,000. Italy produced 10,000. The numbers contain the outcome before a single engagement is assessed, where Italian formations receive the conditions that partially compensated for these deficiencies: unified command, adequate logistics, concentrated training, limited and precisely defined objectives. They produced results consistent with competent armoured and infantry formations of the period. Nikolaevka demonstrated what the Alpini could produce under the worst conditions imaginable. The Ariete's last transmission at El Alamein recorded what an Italian armoured division looked like when it had been properly used. The Decima MAS operators who reached the bottom of Alexandria harbour recorded what Italian military training could produce when resources were concentrated on a specific and achievable capability. None of it was enough. The structural gap between Italian industrial capacity and the demands of total industrial warfare was too wide, the political dysfunction at the top too consistent, and the time available too short. Italy entered the war 4 years before Mussolini's own assessment said it should. It fought across 6 theatres simultaneously on an industrial base suited to one. The armed forces bore the weight of that calculation across 5 years and 3 continents. The men who carried rifles and drove tanks into those campaigns did not fail because they lacked courage. They failed because the state that sent them to war had never built the foundation that war required.